wgnieciemy w ziemię. Prędzej czy później trafi tam, gdzie powinien trafić. Za kraty albo na cmentarz. Putin jest wrogiem ludzkości.
Chcę to bardzo mocno podkreślić. W tych dniach, w tych tygodniach ważą się losy Ukrainy. I nie musi nikogo przekonywać, że to znaczy, że także nasze losy się ważą. Każdy taki atak w przestrzeni publicznej, wsparcie putinowskiej narracji jest zdradą stanu.
Taki plecak, czy taki sprzęt, posiadanie takiej...
Walimy usłyszeć jeszcze dużo! Rakiety! Walimy!
Hello. Cameron Macgregor. Hi, Cameron.
Hi, Michał. Good to talk to you. Dzień dobry.
Dzień dobry. How are you? My brother from another mother.
That's right. I miss Poland. I miss my Polish friends, and certainly I miss you. So I hope you're well. I hope the audience is doing well, and let's chat.
Yeah, we are on X. We are on my social media. I haven't been a long time on my social media. I was doing some business. You also do some business, but different kind of business because you were in Russia, and now you are in Turkey. So first of all, I would like to ask you, why are you going to Russia? Why are you going to Turkey? Why are you going to Russia under sanctions, under the war with the West? What is the reason? Could you explain? Point out, why are you the Polish onuca? You know onuca, so the sock of the soldiers of the Red Army crossing to the Europe. Why are you,
Right.
collaborating with the enemy of the West?
Yes, well, it's a good question, and to some degree, it answers itself. I think what attracted me was precisely the fact that Russia has been sanctioned. It's definitely become a villain in Western Europe, at least among the elites. I don't think so among European populations. Certainly not among Americans. But it carries this sort of villainous name and reputation. So I wanted to get on the ground and see what the hell was really going on, as I've done over the last 5, 6 years of my life. As you know, I went to Poland in 2022. I was in France, I was in Deutschland, I was in a lot of places, in part because I'd heard from a lot of Americans how hopeless the situation was in Europe. And I never really believed that, but I wanted to go to Europe and just see how bad it was in countries like France and cities like Paris. And in some cases, yeah, things are pretty bad. You know, there's refugees and immigrants everywhere. The economy's not strong. But the situation is far from hopeless because the actual state of the political class across Europe, not just in France, but also in Poland, is very fragile, as you know. So to some degree, I wanted to go to Russia and say, okay, what is fact and what is fiction? And I'll say a few things. The first is it's not easy to get to Russia. You have to get a visa. You cannot fly directly from Western Europe or the United States. You have to fly through Istanbul, Turkey. You can also get there through Belgrade and Serbia and Dubai, but it's not all that easy to get there. It's a relatively long flight, not as long as you might think, but definitely a 12-hour journey, all things considered, depending on where you fly from. And I flew from Budapest to Istanbul, and then from Istanbul to Moscow. And when you get to Moscow, your cell phone doesn't work, your credit cards don't work, you can't use Uber, all of these kinds of things. There are no McDonald's, there's no Starbucks. So a lot of what is customary to the West, or that we've grown accustomed to, it's just not available. And so you've got to figure out a way to transfer money and get rubles. You don't have a bank account, so you have to pay in cash. You have to get a Russian SIM card so that you can actually get cell phone service. And that's not easy because of language barriers. Unfortunately, I had people that helped me with all of these things. but it wasn't easy. So I landed in Moscow, which is about an hour and a half from the Kremlin, and I immediately had to deal with some of these impediments. And for example, I couldn't use my cell phone, so I had to find Wi-Fi. Then I had to order an Uber through what they call Yandex, which meant I had to download Yandex, all these sorts of things. So anyway, I figured it out. But what I discovered was that Russia looks very different than what you have been told. The first is that Moscow in particular, but Russia in general, and I drove through large parts of it actually, which we'll talk about in a minute. But Moscow is a very clean city. It's a very modern city. A lot of what you might conceive of the sort of legacy of the Soviet period and then the breakdown and corruption in the 90s, that's been addressed. The buildings have been recovered or rebuilt. The highway systems are relatively modern. The metro system is excellent. And people are, I would say, relatively well dressed. They're economically productive. There is a sense of self-confidence among them, although a lot of Russians, Mikhail, they still sort of idolize the West. So some of them have heard rumors, that there's a lot of crime, that there are problems, but they still sort of see the West as above them and Russia below, which is not all that bad to some degree. But yeah, what I found was a country that was finally sort of regaining a sense of itself, that had a sense of orthodoxy, the Orthodox religion was very strong and getting stronger. And I would say Russian national identity was strengthening and moving in the right direction. So those are my initial interpretations. And certainly that comes across as, I think, very different from what you hear in the West, which is a society that's run by a dictator. It is not. Or a country that's on the verge of collapsing. It's not. Or a society that's very divided. And I did not feel that at all. In fact, I felt that Russia, even though it is very diverse, Russia is not an ethno-state. There are many different kinds of people there: Chechens, Dagestanis, Uzbeks, Tajiks, all of these kinds of people that fall under this umbrella of the Russian Federation. They're very different. They speak different languages. They have different religions, but they tend to congeal around this idea of Russian national identity, which is basically the Russian language, Russian Orthodoxy, and at this stage, I would say the Russian government, led by the National Security Staff and Vladimir Putin. So those are some of the initial impressions I had.
Mhm. So you have been in out of the Mac world, like Benjamin Barber was saying that there is a Mac world, the globalistic world that came from your home country, maybe not from yourself because you were like a citizen and nationalist of United States, but the global structure of the corporation that are registered in your company and create a globalistic structure on different nations. So the Mac world. So you basically went outside of the Mac world. So McDonald's world. Benjamin Barber came to this saying because of that the United States are putting everywhere the global corporations like the McDonald's, and also when George Bush was invading Afghanistan, he was saying that, or Iraq, he was saying that we are introducing the higher culture of United States. But of course, it's not a culture of United States, but the culture of this globalistic corporations. Yes. So basically, you had some time to go outside of the Mac world. And my question would be, how do you mentioned some of this, but how do you felt as an American from the core of this, the Sauron core of the globalistic, because you're from Washington, so from the core of the core, so the Sauron eye, it's in the Washington. I'm not anti-United States, but anti-globalistic. So I'm only saying in this kind of regards. Of course, I'm for nationalists in the United States and nationalists in other countries. But so, could you say how do you felt going out? Because you say few things about it. And the second question would be, how do you think Russians are feeling after those now 4 years of sanctions. Do you feel that how they exist? Because in Poland, in different countries, there is this propaganda. There are almost can distinguish. They can't live without the corporations. They can't live without the globalistic technologies. Could you give me some insight on your thoughts about it and feelings?
Yeah, a couple things. It is the distinction you make is interesting. The globalist umbrella over Western Europe, the United States, Canada, does create a kind of separate parallel universe. And when you leave that separate parallel universe, in a country like Russia, I would include China, large parts of Asia. You might even say most of the world actually is outside of that globalist umbrella. The world is very different in many ways. A couple things to say right off the bat. The first is the Russians. I was under the impression before I went to Russia that when Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin decided to go into Ukraine, that decided to commence a special military operation, that they were ready for the full arsenal of sanctions that would blow back on them. And after being in Russia, I can tell you they were not. They were not ready, which was quite a shock. And part of the reason they were not ready, Mikhail, is because they did not expect the West to react the way that they did. And you have to understand from the Russian point of view, they have acted with tremendous restraint. They have been very measured, and that this was a conflict that slowly escalated. I mean, a lot of people will talk about 2022 when the Russian special military operation began, and they actually went into the Donbass, which is this disputed territory. Some people would go back 10 years before that in 2014 when there was this Maidan coup and the overthrow of a government that the Russians believe and a lot of people suspect was a color revolution launched by the CIA and people like Victoria Nuland. But the reality is, from the Russian vantage point, this sort of split or this escalation, if you will, starts when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved and some promises were made. Promises made specifically by George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State James Baker, not to move NATO east. And a lot of these talks were premised on the idea that Germany would be reunified, assuming there was a guarantee that Ukraine in particular would be neutral, that NATO would not expand into it, and that would create a buffer between Russia and the West. And the Russian point of view, Mikhail, is that that commitment, not only was it broken, but it was abused. And so Ukraine became a front for NATO expansion and anti-Russian sentiment. So they perceive this as a defensive war and a defensive conflict. And so when they went into Ukraine, they were smashed with all manner of sanctions, and they weren't all that prepared. I think they've made incredible adjustments. And what the sanctions have actually done is they've strengthened the Russian economy, in part because they forced Russia off of a lot of the Western financial institutions. And so they have embraced new ones, right? And this is to some degree the justification for BRICS, but they have developed closer partnerships with the Chinese and the Indians in particular. But a lot of the money that would sort of be reinvested in the West, go into Western stock markets, that money is now being reinvested in Russia. So to some degree, the sanctions have actually strengthened Russia. And so when you go there today, you don't sense at all a kind of desperation of the population or a forlonging that the good old days are over because they're not connected to Western banks. That's just not the case at all. If anything, life has just sort of moved on. It's gotten better. So that's one thing. The other is that in the United States, there's a lot of Russophobia in the mainstream media. There's a lot of Russophobia among the foreign policy establishment and in the government. And I think that's doubly so in Western Europe. Maybe it's even stronger in Western Europe, especially in England, France, and Germany among the elites. But the Russians are actually very congenial towards the West and especially towards the United States. And in fact, a lot of the Russians I met were pro-American and pro-Trump in a very vociferous fashion, which was very surprising, right? Because you would think that by virtue of being vilified in the West, that they would then sort of antagonize us as well. I didn't get that sense at all. They were more befuddled by the furor in Western Europe against them. Now that befuddlement, so confusion, or that sort of bafflement that they felt is now, I think, becoming hostility because they're sort of pissed off increasingly that they've been mistreated. That's their point of view by the Western media. And so when I went down to Donbass, for example, a lot of the people down there that were trying to rebuild and reconstruct various things, they wanted that story told because they felt like not enough truth was being told about the special military operation, about the Donbass, about Russia in general, that the truth wasn't getting to the West. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support that. So all that is to say two things. One is that life is proceeding as usual, and I think the Russian economy is still growing. I did not get the sense whatsoever that there was economic inequality, that there was insecurity. Certainly nothing like what you would see in a city like Paris or London. Moscow is not unsafe, and the provinces around it, when you drive through Russia, it strikes me that it's a relatively modern country. It still has its problems. There's no question that it's behind in certain ways. But I would say post-sanctions, life is actually pretty normal. And then secondly, I would say that the culture is very open and congenial towards Westerners, and especially towards Americans. So I was very surprised to see that because that sentiment is not the same in the West.
Yeah, so you mentioned like two things that got my interest in the relation with India and China, so geopolitics. So the sanctions, do you think that the sanctions are pushed Russia for more like Euro-Asian Dugin's projects to cut off the Western Russian, pro-Western Russia politics ideologists and move to cooperation with the Chinese and the Indians. Now the Polish minister, Radek Sikorski, is in India, and of course he's advising India government not to support one of the sanctioned countries because it can be problematic for the global order. So this is one thing. Does the sanction policy pushed, and you said that Russia was forced to reinforce herself and reestablish herself sovereignty on a different kind of sectors of their economy by the sanctions, and on the other hand push the economy and push the industry to connect morely to Russia and China. So basically the outcome of the sanction policy was not to force Russia to withdraw with the war in Ukraine, but basically the outcome of it is that Russia is more self-sufficient in some regards, and in some regards more Euro-Asian, not more European country, but more Asian country connection with the Chinese and Indians. And the second question would be about let's focus on this first question, and then I'm gonna move to the second one.
Okay. Yes, this is a good question. So just to restate, to be clear, so your question is along the lines of what Alexander Dugin, for example, has said, which and I would say his emphasis is on multipolarity. So the rise of civilizations, particularly outside the West, that are on different trajectories. You know, whether it's Chinese or Sino civilization, the Indians, certainly Russia, and Russia is turning in their direction as opposed to the West. I would say that's partially true and it's partially not true. The Russian grand strategy as of today, as far as I can understand it, is threefold. Number one, in the near abroad, it is to win in this war in Ukraine. And how do they win this war? I think that is also becoming clearer. The first is they've got to, from their vantage point, they have to destroy the Zelensky regime. It must be utterly toppled. And to guarantee that whoever replaces Zelensky's regime is not a puppet of NATO. So they need to de-NATOize Ukraine and maintain, or rather retrench it as a buffer state. That is marshaling all of the resources, not all, the majority of the resources inside of the Russian political, military, economic apparatus right now. That's their principal focus. And as I said, it's not just about deploying armed forces, it's also about reconstruction in Ukraine. So that's number one. Number two is multipolarity. And this is congruent with what Alexander Dugin has talked about. There is a profound emphasis in the Kremlin right now on strengthening relations with the global South, specifically with China and India, but not them alone. Strengthening relations with the Saudis, strengthening relations with countries in Africa, strengthening relations outside of the globalist core, as you say, period. And the Russians, I think, are trying to do business with anyone and everyone they can that is open to doing business with them. And I think that they're becoming, to a large extent, or rather they have been, the leaders of BRICS for a couple reasons. One is because they have been sanctioned more than anybody else. There's no question about that. All the BRICS members, for example, have been sanctioned by the West at one time or other. In fact, to a large extent, that is the justification for BRICS, right? That was the prime mover for BRICS. But the Russians have been sanctioned more than anybody else. So that's number one. Number two is that they are actively fighting a proxy war, maybe, depending on how you want to look at it, they're an actual war with the West. And I say that because the sense from a lot of the Russians is that they're already operating against Poles, Romanians, maybe Scandinavians, maybe Brits. This is their thinking. I don't necessarily think that that's the case, but from their vantage point, yeah, maybe there's kinetic activity that's already going on between the West and Russia beyond just a proxy conflict. So that's number two. And three is that the Russians have a vision of a sort of post-dollar world. And this vision has been expressed by people like Sergei Glasniev, who is an economic advisor in the Kremlin. And he has outlined a sort of post-dollar multipolar monetary order and been, I think, evangelical about that. In other words, he's pushed it, and the Russians have pushed it more so than the Chinese and the Indians, who are still somewhat stuck in the status quo. In other words, they're okay with the dollar persisting. That's changing, I think. But for those reasons, the Russians are driving BRICS forward. And I think every month that passes, particularly given the erratic behavior in the United States, the Chinese, the Indians, they're more open to this sort of post-dollar, multipolar monetary world order is what I would call it. However, number three is that the Russians, certainly under Putin, they're still open to the West, Michal. So they have not, in their minds, affected a complete decoupling. Now, they have decoupled in some very clear ways that have strengthened Russia. So I'll just give you a few examples. They don't have Uber, so they have Yandex Uber, effectively. They don't have Google Maps, so they have Yandex Maps. They don't have McDonald's, so they have their own version of it. They don't have Starbucks, they have Star Coffee, things of this nature. And while these are subtle, and a lot of people say they're sort of superficial, what the Russians have concluded, along with a lot of folks, I think, around the world, is that they can actually replicate everything that is quote unquote Western. In other words, they don't need a lot of what comes out of the West anyway. And this has, like I said, built a sense of self-confidence and resilience in them, but they are still open to the West. And I think Putin, especially, he sort of regards a lot of the Western Europeans as clowns that are self-destructive. And so I think in his mind, it's possible that they could still forge a new course forward with a renewed political partnership in the West. A lot of damage has been done, but they haven't closed the door yet. So we're not in Dugin's world yet by any means. However, the future of that relationship and which direction Russia turns, that hinges entirely on how this war ends in Ukraine. If it metastasizes and if the West is brought into it, which is what a lot of the Russians think is about to happen, not all of them, but a lot of them think that, then all bets are off. And Russia may close its doors to the West for, I don't know, decades, maybe longer. But for the time being, there is still this hope that they can de-escalate, that the Western Europeans and a new form of economic, maybe post-EU or post-NATO world can reopen doorways to the West. We'll have to see. So I would say Dugin's right to some degree, and the Russians have weathered the storm. They've readjusted economically, as has a lot of countries around the world, by the way, not just the Russians, but the Russians especially have. But there's still hope that the door to the West is not closed. And I don't think it is closed yet, but that could change depending on how the war in Ukraine ends.
Yeah, you told us that you have been in Donbass. Could you give us some impressions from your stay? How long you have been staying there in Donbass? And you told me also about you spoke with Russian soldiers from the war zone about their mindset, what they're thinking, what they are, how they are preparing, what they're gonna do in the future. You told me that they are thinking that they're gonna wage war not only with Ukraine but also Western countries like Polish, Romanians, and others. Could you give us your experience, your feedback from your experience with your say how Donbass looks now? Could you give us some insight in this regards?
Yeah, so let me be very careful with the language because, the first observation is that what's happening in Ukraine right now is a major war. It is not a geopolitical chess move. It is not a proxy war. It's a real war. And the Russians interpret it that way. I think the Ukrainians do as well. But these adjacent powers, I don't know what they think. I don't know that they fully comprehend the loss of human life, the destruction of urban communities and areas. And when I was down there, that's what I saw. I saw areas obliterated. And it looked like the Second World War. I mean, some of these areas were absolutely devastated. HIMAR missile damage, a lot of drone damage. And actually, I was in a few areas. So I was in Donetsk city, inside Donetsk, and I was also in Avdiivka, which is about 15 or 20 kilometers, I think, from the front. And it's still a dangerous area, still a very precarious zone. There was artillery fire going on. There were drone strikes that were happening in some of the areas that I was in. And whole neighborhoods, as I said, just obliterated. You drive down city blocks and it's quite harrowing. And you'll see stray animals. So the loss of human life is immense. However, at the same time, there's a very resilient effort to reconstruct large parts of Donbass. And specifically when I was in Mariupol, which is another city inside Donetsk, the Russians had made every effort to rebuild highways, apartment complexes, public parks, gymnasiums, the whole shebang. And I think they've made a lot of headway. So certainly that area, Mariupol, looked a lot better than Avdiivka, for example, but it was still in the throes of recovery. I mean, large parts of that city had been fought over in intense urban combat, and in some cases, house-to-house combat. So you could see that. You could see a lot of residue from artillery shells, from gunfire, that sort of thing. So the first takeaway and observation is this is a very, very serious and dangerous conflict that's killed millions of people and threatens to kill a lot more, and potentially tens of millions if things get out of control. And I certainly hope to God that does not happen. The second is that the Russians, I think, are increasingly upset. They're upset by how they've been vilified in Western media. They don't trust the West at all anymore, or if they do trust them, it's very precautionary. It's under very specific circumstances that they're open to negotiations, that sort of thing. But as I said, their view is that this war was brought on them. It is really not for me to say these things one way or the other. My job is to relay their perspective. That's all I can really do. But their sense is that the West wants a war, and that there's a steady escalation in that direction. I do not believe that they want that war. I am confident the Kremlin absolutely does not want that war. And I don't think most Western Europeans want an escalation at all. Certainly Americans do not. Now, I should delineate between their perspective of Western Europeans and the United States. A lot of the Russians have high hopes that Trump will bring an end to the war, and they feel that America does not want anything to do with this war. I think that's a more checkered case as well, because certainly the foreign policy establishment in the U.S., they are no different than the globalists in the EU. They also are very Russophobic. I think some of them hate the Russians and they want escalation. But populations in the United States are anti-war. They don't want war any more than the Western Europeans do. But in the Russian mindset, from the Russian soldiers that I spoke to, who I specifically asked, I said, do you think the worst is behind you? Do you think that this war is now going to taper off, that the end is close at hand? They said no. They felt that things were about to escalate. So that's what I learned when I was down there. The only other thing I will say is that I do think the Russians are winning the war. And I think they're winning the war decisively with one caveat, because of drone technology specifically, and because I think Western armaments and equipment are still very prominent in Ukraine, and God knows what else is happening on that side. There's no question that the Russians have sort of methodically ground down the Ukrainian opposition. So this has not been a war of maneuver. It has not been a war of battles of annihilation. That said, I think that the regime in Ukraine is on the verge of collapse. I absolutely think that that is the case. And there is that sense on the Russian side too. They're just concerned that the Western Europeans will plunge their countries into the war no matter what. I don't agree with them. I don't share that view, but that is their view, and that is their fear.
Polish patriots, Polish nationalists are thinking, that the elites in Poland are pushing, they called it a bumper, a Polish bumper, United bumper against the Russian truck with rubble. So basically, what is the meaning? That the Polish armed forces are not ready, and the Polish society is not ready to go into conflict with Russian Federation. So this is the right-wing thinking in Poland, because we are giving a lot of we gave a lot of our post-Soviet equipment to Ukraine as a strategy of giving the proxy state to fight not for us with the Russia, because of the Russia threat, so-called Russia threat. So could you give some more insight about the Russian mindset soldiers in Donbass, because they are fighting some Polish mercenaries, and what you described, that the mindset of the Russian soldiers are that that those mercenaries are also pushed by the Polish government.
Yes.
And it's like a proxy that basically those mercenaries are ex-soldiers or soldiers that are faking mercenaries to fight them, to be illegal, kind of out of Polish authority war against Russians.
Yes.
Could you give us some insight of their mindset? This is important from Donbass. How they feeling? Do
Yes.
they feel that they are already fighting Russian armies in the uniforms of Ukraine international legions for cooperation, whatever?
Yes. So let me say a couple things first before we get to the proxies. The first thing is regarding readiness. And I emphasized a moment ago the seriousness of the war in part as a warning, because I don't think the West, and when I say the West, I mean Western Europe and the countries that sort of fall under the EU, and specifically, I would say the triumvirate: Great Britain, led by Keir Starmer, Macron in France, and Merz in Germany. These powers, the great powers in Europe, you might say, they are not prepared at all to fight the Russians in any way, shape, or form. They are not prepared to fight what is a heavily industrialized, technologically driven conflict at all. And to the extent that Ukraine has been fought with Western equipment and arms, it has drained the coffers of a lot of Western European countries and the United States too, by the way, to be sure. And secondly, it's been a war of adaptation. And so both sides have adjusted, but the Russians have adjusted because this is a major war that, as I said, is marshaling increasingly a lot of resources across the Russian state. So they are not fully mobilized, I don't think, but they, in terms of capacity, warfighting capacity, so especially since the special military operation began. Remember, it began in February of 2022, okay? So you're talking about increasingly seasoned forces that are learning logistically, that are learning how to deploy technology, that are learning how to cope in a modern war with drones in particular. They have a massive head start. Never mind the fact that this is a war of defense from their vantage point. As I said, this is a war about the national identity, national security, and protection of the Russian people and state. That's the way they think about it. So in terms of readiness, in terms of motivation, the Russians are prepared to escalate. They are prepared to fight a very serious and devastating war in ways that the Western Europeans are absolutely not prepared for, not at all. And I would go one step farther and say that there is also an implication, Mikhail, that I think a lot of elites in Western Europe make, and that is that, well, if they are ensnared in this war, they meaning the Germans, the French, the British, the Poles, et cetera, that inevitably the United States will come in. And if the United States comes in, then Russia will be devastated. I would not necessarily draw that conclusion at all, whether directly or by proxy. I think it is not a good idea to fight a Russian military society and state that are all sort of kicking into gear, because that's what I see happening. So that's the first thing to say right off the bat. The West is not prepared to fight the kind of war that is ongoing in Ukraine, nor should they fight it. The second is, to your question, the Russian mindset, at least from the troops that I spoke to, is that they're already fighting. You know, as I said, that, yeah, there are Poles. Yeah, maybe they're mercenaries. Maybe they're not. But either way, that the Europeans collectively want this war. So the Russian view is increasingly, okay, well, that's what we're gearing up for. Like I said, I think this is extremely dangerous and extremely explosive, this mindset. This is not Putin's mindset. I do not believe it is the Kremlin's mindset at all. But for the soldiers fighting, and maybe the society in general, there's a kind of feverish emotionalism that's generating. I think they're upset about the way the war has been started, how it's been conducted, and the Western role in the process. So this could very quickly get out of control if there is not some kind of regime change in the West. I think that regime change is coming. I think it's coming sooner than people realize, because I think that there is tremendous resentment and anger at governments across Western Europe, particularly because of the financial situation. The standard of living is very bad in Western Europe. I think most of those countries are in recession, or they're trending that way. And then, of course, you've got the immigration problem. And the immigration problem is not just about, Muslims and Africans in France and Germany and countries like that. It's also about mass numbers of Ukrainians that are absorbing a lot of social services in Poland. And I think that's pissed off a lot of the Poles. So all that is to say, it is a dangerous situation. The Russians, they are actively gearing up for an expansion of the war. They're winning the war, and they're fighting a kind of war that the Western Europeans are certainly not prepared to fight. And I don't think the United States is either, by the way. Secondly, the Russian mindset is increasingly concluding that a bigger war is coming, and they're sort of mentally preparing for that because they think they're already fighting it, as I said. And thirdly, the only real solution, I think, outside of the Zelensky regime being utterly smashed and replaced, which does seem possible in the short term, is that you get a massive regime change in Western Europe. By the way, that does not mean an electoral shift in Western Europe. We've all seen elections come and go, and that has not produced any change, as you know. We need something bigger to happen. We need the foundations of the European Union to be shaken. Again, I think that's coming. I think we're getting closer to that. But that's what we need to stop this war, because the entire bureaucracy that runs Europe, all of the bureaucrats in the EU, they are Russophobic and they are jingoistic. They're hawkish towards the Russians, and their view is that the Russians are losing, that they're bogged down, that the Kremlin is weak, that Putin is losing control. I saw the opposite.
Yeah, so it was from 2022 when I was analyzing Polish media and Polish social media. It was also like in other European countries that they were forcing this idea that Russia gonna lose this war because of the sanctions in 2022, 2023, 2024, but it's not happening. It's not happening. So, let's move to the United States, because I would like to know your opinion why Trump is doing his own policy regarding Venezuela and Greenland. Because from the European perspective, from the European Central European perspective, it seems quite difficult to understand. If it's the situation that Trump also said that when you're gonna elect me, I'm gonna finish the Ukraine war. Now he couldn't do it. The war is it's escalating. In the media, we don't say this escalation, but it was what you were describing from the Russian mindset soldiers that are preparing for the major war. This Russian war would be only like a beginning of a major war with the Europeans. And from the Polish perspective, Donald Tusk, Prime Minister, and also other European hawkish, like you said, prime ministers, we can see that there is more and more tensions. I got this kind of brochure. It's
Yes.
wait a second. It's if it's gonna be seen. It's describing what I should do when the war is gonna start.
Oh, God.
What kind of institution I can connect. So basically, this is kind of an institution of. Basically, we are living our own lives. We are doing some business, but the governments are preparing the societies for the war.
Yeah.
So my question would be, why Donald Trump is doing this policy around Venezuela and Greenland? Is it the situation that he wants to show for his audience, for his electorates, that he's doing something because he can't do anything with Ukraine? What is your opinion about it?
Yes, this is a very good question. And let me say a couple things to preface. There was a lot of confusion in Russia about what's happening in the United States. The politics of the US are just not well understood in Europe. They're not well understood in Russia. And I was in China many years ago. They're not well understood in China either. And I can understand why. Our political system is very different. People assume that presidential power is awesome power, that it's ineffable power, that it's overarching power. It is not. They also assume that the U.S. government is sort of an efficient modern machine, and it is not. And I say that as a preliminary because if you understand that the United States state, the government, doesn't function all that well, then it's easier to grasp some of the erratic behavior that you see from administration to administration. So there's that. Secondly, the reason why it doesn't much matter who you elect president in the United States is not all that different from why elections in Europe don't much matter. Whether you're talking about European elections or you're talking about in-country elections. There are three key components, I would say, that you have to understand, that you would have to understand to grasp American foreign policy. The first is, and I call this the triad, the first is the National Security Council / foreign policy establishment. And the National Security Council, which directly advises the president, and I think is chaired by the National Security Advisor, who happens to be Marco Rubio, who's also the Secretary of State right now. More on him in just a moment. But that National Security Council and the foreign policy establishment, and that is to say the Fletcher School, the Kennedy School at Harvard, the Foreign Service School at Georgetown, the nonprofits, the think tanks that dominate Washington, D.C., all of these institutions and the people that they produce are of the same mindset. They're all globalists, more or less. They all regard the world as binary. You're either part of the globalized West or you're the enemy. And they fixate on something called the rules-based order. And that is a term that essentially goes back to the 90s, but the rules-based order, or the liberal international order, has the United States as the center of it, as the enforcer of it, and Western institutions as sort of the police of the world, the police in terms of regulation, the police in terms of interventionism, the police of the seas, the police of democracy, the standard bearers of democracy, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so the foreign policy establishment / National Security Council, they all believe that if you're outside of that liberal international order, like the Russians, the Chinese, or whomever they vilify, whomever they decide to sanction, that they must be contained or potentially destroyed, maybe through a proxy war, which is what we have in Ukraine. It's you could argue what's happening between Israel and Iran in the Middle East. You could argue it's sort of trending that direction between Japan and China, or Taiwan and China. Either way, they are hawkish. They are Russophobic. They regard the non-Western world as descending into an authoritarian tyranny that we must stop. And this is why anybody that opposes them is Hitler reborn. This is the way that they think. The entire establishment, with virtually no exceptions, particularly people that get into government. So that's one. And that has not changed at all. Trump's administration is populated with the same people that the Biden administration was, that Obama's administration was, that Bush's administration was. It's the same kind of people. So that infrastructure has not been challenged. A lot of people thought Trump and MAGA and America First challenged it. They did not. They were part of it. So that's number one. Number two is the military-industrial complex, and that's not just the military. It's the government contractors, again, the think tanks, the nonprofits, all of which make a profit from war. And those industries, those think tanks, like the Institute for the Study of War, for example, they dominate Washington, D.C. too. And they produce the same kinds of people who, again, they may not think in terms of a neoliberal order or rules-based order. They just think in terms of business and money, and war's been good for business and money for a long, long time. So they will support escalation wherever, however they can. They reveled at the Ukraine war because then they can kick into business, building all kinds of military equipment to provide for Ukraine and subsidize the war. So that's number two. And number three are the intelligence agencies, and specifically the CIA, but it's practically conventional wisdom at this stage, but the CIA is a regime change, assassination, interventionist, aggressive platform. And the CIA has been unchallenged. They're still very much in play. They're still very influential behind the scenes. And so they encourage the same kind of behavior, albeit in a slightly different way. So these elements of the triad, again, just to restate, the National Security Council / foreign policy establishment. The second is the military-industrial complex. And the third are the intelligence agencies, all of which are kind of rogue, by the way. These various forces, they pursue their own interests, but those interests do congeal in terms of promoting and provoking war. So Donald Trump, who's one man who staffed his government with these people, they're people like Marco Rubio, who I mentioned a moment ago. Marco Rubio is backed by big donors like Miriam Adelson. And Marco Rubio, what has he been dreaming about for a decade? He's been dreaming about removing Maduro in Venezuela. So to subsidize that special interest, you might say it's the Cuban lobby, the neoconservatives, the CIA, which has been on the ground in Venezuela and other parts of Latin America for a long, long time. All of that came together. And I think Trump allowed it to happen because all the safeguards, and by safeguards, I mean institutional preventive measures that could stop a war, stop escalation, they're gone because Trump has essentially capitulated to special interests. He gave them what they wanted. Now, he gave them what they wanted in part because there is a political stalemate in Ukraine. There's a diplomatic quagmire, and Donald Trump was unable to normalize relations with the Russians. He was unable to make his famous phone call and end the war because of the various actors that I just mentioned, all of whom came with him into power. So when he turns to them and says, I want to normalize with the Russians, I want to end the war in Ukraine, he only has but so much wiggle room before they shut him down. And that's why you saw aid cut off initially. You saw tension between Trump and Zelensky. But at the end of the day, his policies are the same as Biden's. So armaments and equipment continue to flow. Zelensky's still welcome to the White House, and the war continues. And Putin and the Russians are still enemies. They're persona non grata. So it is because of continuity of the structure of government that we are in this position. And now the special interests are just getting their way. And in part, they're getting their way because domestically, Donald Trump is losing support. The America First / MAGA base is upset. They're upset about perpetuating wars overseas, particularly about Israel. And I didn't even mention the Zionist lobby, but the Zionist lobby is practically more powerful in Washington, D.C. than President Trump is. And he got elected, I think, with a promise to Miriam Adelson, the donor class, and the Zionists that there would be a direct provocation with Iran. That violates the America First paradigm, but he went along with it because if he didn't, he wouldn't have been president. So that's another special interest. So Venezuela, I think, became a distraction. It was a way for the president to get an easy win, so to speak, to remove Maduro by bribing local government officials and pretending it was some military victory and distracting his base from the fact that the economy is not good, wars overseas have continued, and his agenda domestically has been stalled. So all that is to say, things are kind of careening out of control in the U.S. And I know most of you have not heard that. What you're hearing is that this is geopolitical chess, that there's a broader strategy, a shift towards the Monroe Doctrine. There's nothing of the kind. The Monroe Doctrine has nothing to do with regime change in Venezuela whatsoever. It has nothing to do with going into sovereign countries, smashing their governments, seizing their resources, and sort of laying claim to them imperialistically. That has nothing to do with the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was very specifically about keeping foreign powers from subverting and undermining other powers in our hemisphere. There's no evidence that was happening in Venezuela. The Chinese, yeah, they're there. They're doing business with the Venezuelans. So are we under Maduro. So that's hardly imperialism. What we did is imperialism, you could argue, not what the Chinese are doing. What the Chinese are doing is building infrastructure, roads, trade agreements, supply chains all across South America. It is not clear at all what going into Venezuela did to change that in any way, shape, or form. It's also not clear that we have access to their oil. It's not clear that threatening Greenland and by extension Denmark is in any way beneficial to the United States. So what I would say, Mikhail, to answer your question is the situation domestically in the U.S. is very precarious. It's very fragile. We have a president who just hasn't been able to make headway. His agenda has been bottled up. And so he's turning externally. And ironically, he's doing so in ways that are very similar to Keir Starmer. In the UK, domestically, everybody hates him. So what does he do? He focuses on foreign policy, he focuses on Ukraine. Macron, very
Mm.
unpopular. So what does he do? He focuses on Russia. Merits, exactly the same. This is what you're seeing in the United States too. That's what's happening in my view.
Basically, the global policy is a hostage of the rivalry between the American governmental administration silos, basically some part of the government of the United States rivalry, competition. You told us the military complex. You told us about the CIA, different kind of structure of the U.S. government competing with each other, and this
Yes.
Donald Trump, the president of the United States, who was saying that he gonna finalize the war on Ukraine and he can't finish it. So basically, the globalistic international relations are based on the interior problems of the United States. So basically, the next question would be, because you described the complex of the rivalry between the silos of the United States government, how United States society reacts internally on this rivalry between some agendas in the United States and how it's influenced the policy of the United States. So basically, the society and the government issue.
Yes, so this is a very good question, and I think it is the same template in Europe. What the public is discovering, Mikhail, is that democracy is broken. That as structured, it doesn't matter who you vote for, it doesn't matter what the referendum says, you're going to get a continuity of policymaking. People thought that the United States was different because of Donald Trump, and there are still a lot of Americans, there's still a lot of support for Donald Trump. So what you've heard me say is still fringe, but it's spreading. And it's spreading in part because things domestically in the economy are very poor in the United States. I think we are on the cusp, if not already in a recession. Tens of millions of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. That number is growing. And the economic pain that's at lower levels is spreading to higher levels. While you have a very small cadre of people, many of whom advise the president, people like Stephen Witkoff, Howard Lutnick, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, guess what they all have in common? They're all billionaires. They're all rich, and they're getting richer by virtue of being in government. Again, Trump was supposed to voice the inequality. He was supposed to address the drastic disempowerment of the society. That's not happening. And so more and more Americans are figuring this out and they're getting pissed off about it. But it hasn't hit a majority of the population yet. A majority is still very much convinced that Donald Trump is acting in their best interest. A recession or an economic downturn or a financial crisis, which I think we're actually experiencing now, and I think it's beginning to spiral out of control, that will smash that illusion completely, but we're not quite there yet. However, on the fringes in the US, and I think this is happening in Europe too, are new sort of nationalist movements. And I've talked about this for years, but it is beginning to get stronger. And specifically in the US, we have the America First movement, and the America First movement and the Make America Great Again movement are there. These are not the same things at all. And so the America First movement, which is largely online, and they follow people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, people of that nature. There's tens of millions of people like that, or certainly 10 million at least. And these folks, what they see are more wars overseas, specifically for special interests, especially for Israel, maybe for the Cuban lobby, maybe because of a foreign policy establishment that's Russophobic, maybe for the military-industrial complex, right? Either way, they're not getting a disengagement. They're not getting an America First foreign policy. They see an economy that's getting worse, not better, despite what the president says. They see inflation continuing to stay high and in some cases go higher. They see cities that are lawless. And yes, the president has tried to leverage federal power. He's tried to use federal agencies like ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to actually go into cities, arrest people, and expel them in mass. Because remember, we have tens of millions of illegal immigrants in the United States. I think we have 50 million, maybe more than that. 50 million is like taking all the illegals in Europe combined, the refugees and so forth, and putting them in one country. That's how many we have. But even that isn't really going to plan.
It's more than Polish population. The Polish government, Polish state population. It's around
Yeah.
13,
Yeah,
9 million.
I mean, there's what, 30 million Poles, right? Maybe 35 million Poles. So the numbers are just
39.
astronomical. And essentially what you've got left, Mikhail, is a president who's running a marketing campaign that's trying to convince the population that America First is happening, that the corruption is being dealt with. And meanwhile, the president, his family, they're getting rich. And they're getting a lot richer while things are getting worse for most Americans. So all that is to say, the situation in the U.S. is the same as Europe. It's the same. There is no difference. The elites in the U.S. are the same as Europe. That's what Europeans need to understand. And Russians need to understand that too. That was not well understood in Russia. In fact, a lot of Russians thought that Trump and the elites around him were completely different. And I said, no, that is not the case. They're exactly the same. So yeah, this is where we are.
Yeah, Trump was on the Epstein Island, so basically
Yes.
it's one of the part of the elites. It's one of the part of the military complex. It's one of the part of the intellectual secret society, secret service society in the United States. Basically, it's one of the part of it, and it's not anti of it. So you, Cameron, you running neo-masculinity. Neo-masculinity. I can show. I know it's if it's in YouTube channel. So basically, a channel is about finance, freedom, and neo-masculinity. It's about embracing. It's about embracing a changed world of modern men, maximizing your talent and ability, and becoming part of something bigger than yourself. The world needs strong men more than ever. So welcome men and the city. So could you explain why you're doing this channel and why neo-masculinity movement has why it's important, why it's important in the neo-feminist world, why it's in the wokeist world, it's important, why men must discover your manhood once more and be a man in the age of the women, why we can't leave the women this age, why we must do this counter warfare against women. Are we doing against women or are we doing for the women? Could you explain this idea of what you're pushing in this YouTube channel, please?
Yes. So a couple things. Right now, as we've discussed during this interview, and just to be clear, we've talked about a major war in Ukraine. We've talked about the potential for an expansion of that war. We've talked about economic strain, the standard of living falling, prices rising. We've talked about governmental turmoil, the potential for very real regime change in countries like France. France is a great country. It's got a long storied history. So maybe the Fifth Republic, which currently governs France, is sort of the constitutional framework of the country, that may collapse. Domestically in the United States, as I said, you've got tens of millions of illegal immigrants. You have all of these kinds of problems. And so what that often leads a lot of people to conclude is that the West and Western Europe specifically are finished, that they have no hope, they have no future, that the situation cannot be turned around. And I do not agree with that. I don't think that that's what's happening at all. In fact, what I see happening is that the legacy structure of the West, which is embedded in these globalist institutions, whether it's the IMF, the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, the European Union, the European Central Bank, the European Parliament, the European Commission, things of that nature. And certainly in the United States, the uniparty system, the Republicans, the Democrats, the triad that I described, that actually these institutions are crumbling because they don't work anymore, because they're shamelessly corrupt, because the technocrats that operate them are running the ship aground. And that means that there's tremendous opportunity. And opportunity because even though, as I said, inside the citadel, inside the halls of power, there's confusion, there's delusion, there's aggression, warmongering, all of these things. What's happening on the street level with young men in particular, young men who, lest we forget, have been emasculated because of feminism. They've been vilified by globalists as the standard bearers of Western civilization, of nationalism, things that they regard as existential threats to their order, and they are. Nationalism is a direct threat to the European Union. Sovereignty is a direct threat to globalism. It's a direct threat to the technocrats that run our countries and have run them into the ground. In these young men, and I know Poles, I know Hungarians, I know Frenchmen, I know Germans, I know Spaniards, I know Americans, Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians. Something is happening. And what's happening is a rekindling of identity, specifically a sense of aggressive masculinity is coming back, revolt and a resurrection. This is not about going back to the past. It's not about tradition per se. I'm not against tradition, but tradition often couches itself in looking back. We need to adjust to a different world. We need to reimagine how we're going to act and think and fight for our identity, fight for our societies. That is what I call neo-masculinity. And that neo-masculine sentiment, that fire in young men that's getting stronger outside the citadel, those men are beginning to organize themselves. They're beginning to rekindle with the identities of the past to connect to a new identity in the future. And they're going to change the world. They're going to reset and I would argue build a neo-renaissance in the West. And this is going to demand cooperation between all of these groups that I mentioned, Czechs and Slovaks and Poles and Serbs and Germans and Frenchmen and Brits and Dutch and so forth and so on, and Americans, among others, because we are all fighting the same battle together. So my channel is a bridge. It's a node connecting all of these networks together and offering a new idea. And that idea is that the West is not finished, that it's actually rebirthing, but that the rebirth is going to be painful. There's going to be collateral damage. I hope there is not an escalation in Ukraine, but I'm here to warn you of the danger of that. And we have to deal with it. We got to deal with these things. And part of rekindling our identity is to expel, it's to purge the delusions. You know, the idea that we have to go fight these evil monsters, whether they're in Russia or Iran or China. No, we don't. We have demons inside that we have to deal with. And that's what neo-masculinity is all about. That's what my channel is all about. I would just add a couple things because this is important. I do admire Evola, and you know there are many people like him. Certainly, I've read Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Alexandrovich Ilyin is another very famous person in Russia who I've read, who wrote a very famous book about the necessity of using force to fight evil, for example. But a couple things. We're not going to have to defeat feminism. Feminism is defeating itself, is my view. The liberal order as we understand it, it's crumbling. It's crumbling right before us. As I said, democracy is not something that's all that attractive to democracy as structured, I should say. This sort of perversion of liberalism, globalism that we live with, that's falling out of favor. And the institutions that activate it, they're collapsing. Currencies are losing value. Gold is rising. Proxy wars are being lost. And new civilizations are ascendant, civilizations that are certainly closer to tradition. But what we've got to do is prepare for this transition that's coming. We have to prepare for a post-EU world. We have to prepare for a post-NATO world. In the United States, we have to prepare for a post-Constitution because these legacy institutions are broken and they're going to collapse, and the social contract will collapse along with them. So we, these neo-masculine men, we are the vanguard of a new movement. And that means that it's not just about aligning with the principles of masculinity, which are transcendent, right? They go beyond time and space, but it's also reimagining how we organize. We use new platforms today, whether it's on the internet, it's cryptocurrency, new organizational structures. And I think now is the time for a kind of international vanguard. 50 years ago, would I have been talking to a Pole in Warsaw about the future of the West? Probably not. But now I do, right? I talk to Germans and Hungarians and Poles and Czechs and Frenchmen and so forth and so on. And I continue to emphasize that because we have to build a new kind of vanguard across the Western world that is united by one thing, and that is by a desire to reinstitute sovereignty and to build new institutions to protect sovereignty. That's what we've got to do. And the good news is we don't have to destroy the old. It's being destroyed. So in a sense, I would say to Evola, who wrote, we need to ride the tiger. No, I think we need to become the tiger, but we need to reimagine what that looks like. We have to reconstruct a tiger, so to speak, because a sort of dragon-like explosion of nationalism, I call it Masco-nationalism, that's what's coming. That's what's ahead. And that Masco-nationalist fervor is going to restore the balance. We just have to imagine what that might look like and build institutions, organizations, and a vanguard to implement it. That's what I'm working on. That's the epicenter of my ideas. And that's why I think we're not finished, that we're sort of headed for a Sobieski moment in which the West is going to rebirth.
Yeah, so to finalize, Cameron, we are fighting, you as a US citizen and me as a Polish citizen, for equilibrium, to reestablish the equilibrium between kind of natural forces in the societies, in the world, between states, like a natural order, also in international relations, also on the level of citizens. So counter-revolution, I can say, some kind of counter-revolution. So
yes,
the revolution that changed the order that we're living in. So
that's right.
yeah, Cameron.
That's right. And we have to think bigger, right? Because a lot of nationalists, as you know, Mikhail, it's, well, let's start a political party. Let's vote for Czegos Brown, and Confederacja. Let's vote for AFD. Let's vote for Mia Hazank. Let's vote for, I don't know, the Reform Party in England. But what you and I are doing and what we're talking about is much bigger than that. It's much, much bigger. The entire European Union is going to collapse. NATO is going to dissolve. And that's what you're seeing happen now. It's harrowing. It's scary. The dollar is going to collapse. But we're going into a world that I think is going to be better and more realigned with this balance of forces. And remember something else. I'll leave you with this. Russia is reorganizing itself to be more orderly. China has rebuilt itself and has become more ordered. India is developing. These countries, they have problems, but they're becoming more stable, not less. So this is not 1939. We're not going into a very dangerous world in which mass armies are going to fight one another. If we can prevent these Western bureaucrats, these globalists, from plunging the West into a war or wars that we should absolutely not fight. The real war is a spiritual war. It's a war we're fighting internally, and we've got to reset the balance of sovereignty. And to do that, we've got to think differently. We've got to build new things and think bigger than just creating a party or a Facebook group. We've got to construct a vanguard, and we need to embrace a new future that's going to be better. I think the world on the other side it's going to be restored equilibrium, to use your term. That's what it's going to be.
Yeah. So I think that everything what's happening now in the world, we can see as a threat, and on the other side, we can see as a opportunity that the world is re-establishing for the natural order, and each citizen of the United States, Czechia, Russia, Polish, France, different countries, China, we must think how we can re-establish our life to these processes that are gonna happen. So yeah. So Cameron, thank you for your insight. Thank you for your intellectual thoughts about it. I think we are speaking about some things that not all Poles, not all United States citizens, not all Russian citizens are thinking, but they are happening. They are happening now, and what we can do is only try to inform our co-citizens what direction that they can think about, and try to manage their own lives to the waves of the time and the history that is happening now.
Exactly. Dzięki.
Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much,
Do widzenia.
Cameron. It was always a pleasure. It was my brother from another mother.
Absolutely. That's right.
Thank you.
God
man.
bless.
Have a good night in Turkey. God bless. God bless all nations and all that seek peace.
Putina wgnieciemy w ziemię. Prędzej czy później trafi tam, gdzie powinien trafić. Za kraty albo na cmentarz. Putin jest wrogiem ludzkości.
Chcę to bardzo mocno podkreślić. W tych dniach, w tych tygodniach ważą się losy Ukrainy. I nie musi nikogo przekonywać, że to znaczy, że także nasze losy się ważą. Każdy taki atak w przestrzeni publicznej, wsparcie putinowskiej narracji jest zdradą stanu.
Taki plecak, czy taki sprzęt, posiadanie takiej...
Военные услышат, боже, ракеты, военные.